Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and this is the second half of Lecture 25, The Coming of the Civil War. Now, as always, take a minute, hit pause on this video, and jot down the rest of the lecture outline, including those key terms at the top. Make sure you can always identify the who, what, where, when, and why. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, the 1850s were seemingly, and if you believe this to be so, you're probably right, were seemingly one crisis after another. We went from the crisis in 1849, Commerce of 1850. We had the issue in 1854 over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which broke the two-party system. We have the Bleeding Kansas. We have, the Charles Sumter getting beaten at the Capitol building. We have the Dred Scott decision. We have the John Brown raid. And all of this leads up, all these crises lead up to another presidential election in 1860. But this will be the first election wherein we see a very different Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party had now split into two factions, a northern and southern branch. Southern Democrats did not trust any northern Democratic candidate because they insisted on their property rights, in this case, expanding their property, the institution of slavery. Again, remember, they treat slaves as property. And so in 1860, the Democrats break into this northern and southern branch. The northern Democrats, of course, nominate Stephen Douglas, the Little Giant, the author of the Compromise of 1850. And the Southern Democratic Party nominates John C. Breckinridge, who are for a pro-slavery South. However, remember, we have this new party, the Republican Party. And the Republicans nominate an actual moderate. This is a moderate voice in the Republican Party named Abraham Lincoln. And there would be a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, which basically had no position at all on slavery, but they were what they called a compromise party. Now, the reason I said, I'm going to go back to Lincoln for a minute. The reason I said he's a moderate was because with Lincoln, on the issue of slavery, at least in 1860, the Republican Party platform opposed slavery's extension. In other words, they believed that wherein slavery already resided, i.e. the South, it could stay there. Where Southerners have slaves, keep it. What they opposed was the extension and expansion of slavery. And for the most part, Republican visions and values did not include equal rights for African Americans. In fact, if you know your history at all from high school, if you remember that, there was the great Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which case Abraham Lincoln was asked point blank, do you believe basically in white supremacy? And Abraham Lincoln affirmed that he did believe that African Americans were lower, and that whites were above them racially. Now, you could argue this maybe was political expediency. If he does come out and say he believes in equality, he has no chance at the nomination. Or you can argue that he did believe this and had a change of heart later. It ultimately does not matter in history necessarily, but it is important to understand that he was not advocating for freeing slaves in 1860. He just opposes the extension of slavery. And so when we see the actual electoral map results come in, as you can see, Lincoln wins easily. And this is a very astounding victory. Now, first of all, a couple things to note here. He wins the Electoral College easily. Stephen Douglas does terrible. He basically only wins Missouri and a small part of New Jersey. He does divide, of course, the Democratic vote. But again, even if you add all the other votes together, you're still not beating Abraham Lincoln. But what's interesting, of course, is to look at the popular vote and the popular percentage. Because Lincoln wins less than 40% of the popular vote and still wins. And as you can see, even though Stephen Douglas only won one state or 1.5 states, he does, however, win a much higher number of votes than his Southern Democrat counterpart, Breckinridge. Why? Because the amount of people who are able to vote in the North versus the South and total population issue. But what's even more important was the way Lincoln won because Lincoln's name did not appear on a single Southern ballot. Southerners were so hell-bent on themselves retaining power that they themselves should rule the entire United States and impose their dogma over the United States, that they refused to even put Lincoln's name on the ballot. And thus, he achieves his victory just on the basis of the North through the Electoral College. But again, as you can see, even the United Democratic Party was not going to beat Lincoln this election. And again, remember, Lincoln, his plan is, so he's elected, but remember, his plan is where slavery already exists, it can stay. He just opposes the expansion of it. So what happens next? Now remember, the election's in November of 1860. Abraham Lincoln will not be inaugurated until March of 1861. Remember, back in the 1800s, inauguration day was in March, not January. That won't be changed until the 1940s. So we're 80 years from the happening. So Abraham Lincoln has done nothing yet except to get elected. He's President-elect Lincoln. And his plan, of course, is, guys, you have slavery, you can keep it. We just don't want to see it expanded. But immediately, on December 20th, less than a month, just over a month after the election, 1860, December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes, declaring that, quote, the experiment of putting people with different pursuits and institutions, unquote, under one government, a failure. So again, 6 weeks after the election, remember, it takes a little more time back then to get the election results in. So less than a month after we have President-elect Lincoln, South Carolina secedes. By February 1st, 6 more deep South states secede and follow South Carolina. You see the numbers on your screen. The numbers represent the order of secession. So Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana. A week after this, so February 1st, we now have 7 states seceded, all the way through Texas, all the deep South states, the SEC country, if you will, if you're a sports fan. A week later, so second week of February 1861, again, remember, Lincoln's not been inaugurated yet, he's still not president. A week later, the delegates meet in Montgomery, Alabama, and they create the Confederate States of America and elect their own President Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi senator and cotton planter who has slaves. Now remember, so leading up to March when Lincoln is inaugurated, so the time Lincoln actually becomes officially president, is sworn in March of 1861, we have 2 nations and 2 presidents. And so before Lincoln even takes office, he's faced with one of the biggest crises any president will ever face. 2 nations, 2 presidents, 7 states have seceded and chosen a new leader to represent the Confederate States of America. And he looks at the situation, we look back at history and we say he has 3 options in front of him, 3 choices. Number 1, compromise. That was John Bell's idea, but at this point, can you really compromise? They've already seceded. So that was out the window. Number 2, let those deep South states go in hope to avoid those border states from following suit. Remember, thus far, when he takes office in March, only the deep South, South Carolina, all those kind of burnt orange color ones through Texas. So you could let them go. Just ignore them and hope the other states don't follow them to maintain the rest of the United States. Or 3, try to compel those seceded states to return, which probably means war. So at his inaugural address, Lincoln begins to define, outline his plan to deal with the situation. And he says that he argues unequivocally that he believes you have to enforce the laws of the land. That's the job of the president. He argues the Union of the United States was perpetual and could not be broken. In other words, what he viewed the southern states did, secession, was illegal. He reminded the nation that the, quote, only substantial dispute was one section of our country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. Unquote. Note, he is still maintaining he's not trying to end slavery. He merely wants to prevent its extension. Again, this is key because he doesn't want other states to leave. And quite honestly, the North is not the biggest proponent of ending slavery either. We'll get to that part in a minute. So Lincoln obviously firmly opposes secession, and he refuses any compromise that will that will allow the expansion of slavery. So basically, he's left with very few options. He's only left with option 3. So Lincoln's attention now is to try to maintain law and order. Remember, he deems this what they did illegal, the secession. And so he focuses his attention immediately on a fort in South Carolina called Fort Sumter. Here's the origin. So South Carolina, you see where it's at. South Carolina, this is a federal fort in Charleston, South Carolina, named Fort Sumter. There we go. There's the map of it. And the issue here was, as a federal fort, it was the federal government's job to resupply it. Now, of course, supplies can come in many forms. It could be food, it could be clothing, blankets. It could be fresh water, horses, equipment. It could be ammunition. It could be soldiers. But it's the federal government, their job, to take care of this fort. And so what Lincoln does, trying to be diplomatic about it, he says, okay, what you guys did was illegal. I'm still commander-in-chief, and I'm going to send supplies to Fort Sumter. Now, be very clear, though. He said he will make, quote, no effort to throw in men, arms, or ammunition, unquote, unless the fort was attacked. So on April 12th, again, this is less than a month after he's inaugurated, Lincoln sends a relief expedition. You gotta realize, go back to my map real quick. He goes from Washington, D.C., all the way through Virginia, through North Carolina. Again, these are not seceded states yet. And they venture into South Carolina. No, this is not even on the border of North Carolina. This is in the lower half of South Carolina. This is a long way coming. It's not in secret. It's very in the open. But nonetheless, as it reaches Fort Sumter, this relief expedition, again, no ammunition, no men, just supplies, comes under attack. And we have the first shots of the Civil War on April 12, 1861. Lincoln had been right. The nation could no longer endure half free and half slave. The collision between North and South was not an accidental, unnecessary event, but a, quote, irrepressible conflict between opposing and enduring forces, unquote. Those forces have been at work for many years, for decades, but they had been developing with increased intensity following the Mexican-American War in 1848 and the issue over the expansion of slavery westward. And again, although there are economic issues, there are cultural disputes, there are political oppositions between the North and South, the underlying force, the underlying foundation of all those disputes was the issue of slavery. Now, after Fort Sumter, Lincoln begins to call for state militia volunteers to crush the insurrection. And of course, this action immediately, here's an actual photo from Fort Sumter, but this action after Fort Sumter, when Lincoln calls for state militias to volunteer to crush the insurrection, immediately leads 4 more states to secede: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, those border states. And take note, there are still some slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, that will always remain loyal to the Union despite being slave states. Lincoln calls for 75,000 state militiamen for 90 days of service. And initially, volunteers flood to respond. The 90-day enlistment period signifies that conviction that the conflict would be ended quickly. Both sides, the North, people enlisted quickly. In the South, people were ready to enlist. Both sides believed this would be a quick war. The North due to sheer numbers and industry, the South due to, well, chivalry and training. Now, please note though this war. For the first years of the war, it starts in April of 1861. For the first almost 18 months of the war, the only goal was restore the Union. This is important. Even though slavery was the underlying cause of every foundational issue that led to the war, during the first year plus of the war, the only main goal of Lincoln was the restoration of the Union. In other words, if the South would have came back in quickly, they probably could have kept their slaves, just prevented the expansion of slavery as Lincoln promised. This was the intention. Now, was this because Abraham Lincoln was not in favor of freeing slaves? Well, maybe not. He understood, though, the harsh political reality as well as the public mood. Most Northerners, they supported a war to restore the Union. They do not support a war to emancipate slaves. Most white Northerners saw African Americans as inferior. They feared that emancipation would lure former slaves to the North that would steal and compete for white jobs and for their political rights. In other words, elect people they don't like. And in fact, you'll see a number of Northern race riots and later on draft riots who ignore the draft notices because of over the issue that even though they fight to maintain the Union, they don't support African American rights or African American freedom. So Lincoln, astutely, proceeds very cautiously. Now, finally, in September 1862, he will issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that will go into effect on January 1st, 1863. So again, the war is going to be 18 months old before it ever goes into effect. Now, what the Emancipation Proclamation did and what it said was that, quote, slaves would be forever free, unquote. But which slaves? That's the question here. The Emancipation Proclamation only said that unless rebellious states returned to the Union by January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln, the President of the United States, would declare their slaves forever free. So let me go back to my map real quick here. So those border states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, those are slave states. Did the Emancipation Proclamation actually do anything about their slaves? No. It only dealt with those states who were in open rebellion, i.e. the seceded Confederate States of America, saying that if those states, the Confederate States, would not return by January 1st, then Lincoln was declaring their slaves forever free. The problem with that, does Lincoln have the power to do that? Now, in his mind, yes, because he's president of all, and what he considered the seceded states was done illegally. You can't secede. So in his mind, yes, he believes he has the power to do that. But on the other standpoint, because they have a separate nation in their mind, the southern states do not believe they're under his jurisdiction, Lincoln's jurisdiction. Meaning that the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing. It didn't free a single slave. I don't mean did nothing as in it wasn't important, but it did nothing in regards to freeing a single African American. So why was it important? Well, it was aimed to bring back the states back in. And had they done so, fine. They could have kept their slaves again. But Lincoln knows they're not going to lay down their arms and return by this point. This is 18 months into the war. Instead, what Lincoln was doing with this is preparing Northerners to accept the eventuality of emancipation on the grounds of necessity. In other words, up to this point, they're fighting to restore the Union, but if you restore the Union and maintain a slavery South and free North, you're just kicking the can down the road again like so many compromises did. The Emancipation Proclamation makes no immediate impact on slavery because it only affected slaves living in unconquered portions of the South. And it was silent about slaves in border states. But it changed the nature of the war. The government, for the first time, is committed to the idea of freeing slaves and ending the institution of slavery and preparing Northerners to actually fight for that. Again, very important. And second, and maybe more important in the immediacy, the proclamation sanctioned the accepting of African Americans as soldiers in the Union Army. This is incredibly important because remember, morale is starting to fade after 18 months, 2 years. And now you're going to allow African Americans to fight for their own freedom. So this is, even though technically speaking, the Emancipation Proclamation frees no slaves, it does two very important things. Number one, the first time the U.S. government is committed to freeing slaves, ending slavery. And number two, authorizing black troops. Now, they have been offering since 1861 to serve as troops, but they always been turned away. They were serving as cooks, laborers, teamsters, carpenters, and at one point they composed as much as 1/4 of the Navy. By the time the war ends, thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation, more than 186,000 African Americans serve. That's about 10% of the Union Army. 20% of all African American males in the nation serve. 37,000 die. Now, of the 186,000 who served, about 134,000 were runaway slaves from slave states. But this is heroic numbers, yes. This is important to turning the war. But military service was not something an African American could take lightly, because they're faced with prejudice with their own white counterparts. With the whites in the Union Army, they're segregated units, they're looked down upon, they have to prove themselves constantly in battle to show that they are man enough to fight. So prejudice by the North. But even worse, if they're caught in battle, they will not be treated as POWs like white soldiers would be. Instead, they will be treated as runaway slaves, and they will be killed and executed immediately. And if that wasn't to add insult to injury, they were paid less by the government than white soldiers were. On average, white soldiers were paid $13 a month, black soldiers paid $10 a month, just because, well, they're inferior. And again, this is Abraham Lincoln authorizing this. And if you want to watch a great movie on this, watch the movie Glory. Stars Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick. It's a great movie to watch about African American soldiers in the war. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the actual battles. That's what the textbook is for. Instead, I want to talk about kind of why the North wins. And talk about some myths versus realities. Because the facts are, when I ask most students, this is usually the point of lecture where I ask a student, when they've learned about Civil War, say back in high school, I'll ask, who had the advantage? And some will say the North due to population or due to manufacturing. But most people ultimately have been told the South had a large advantage militarily. And the reality is, the South was very ill-equipped to fight this war. I think that myth has been portrayed in textbooks because the majority of textbooks are written for states in the South, especially Texas, that want to portray a more glorified, romanticized vision of the Old South. You can look it up. There are facts that back this up. But the reality is the North has a tremendous population advantage. This is true. They have about 23 million people in the North, only 9 million people in the South. But despite this overwhelming majority population, the South actually had a little bit better time mobilizing due to the institution of slavery. Because of the institution of slavery, the way it's set up, their hierarchy was as such that they were able to mobilize 80% of their 9 million men versus only 50% of the Northern population. And so even though the North has the advantage still, percentage-wise, the South does far better. Manufacturing, yes. The North has over 100,000 manufacturing firms to just 18,000 in the South. Railroad, the North has twice as much railroad and becomes even more prevalent as the war lingers on because most of the big battles especially, are fought in the South, thus destroying a lot of Southern infrastructure. And then we have the military leadership one. There's a strong myth that the South was way over the top with the advantage when it comes to their military leaders. And it's a fact. Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee were tremendous. They were brilliant military tacticians, trained at West Point, some of the best generals in the world at that time. And yes, they often overmatched their northern counterparts. But both of these two generals fought in the east of the war. If you turn your gaze to the westward side of our country, to the Missouri, the Alabama, the Mississippi, you see a very different story. You see the northern U.S. generals, Ulysses S. Grant, and of course, William Tecumseh Sherman. And out west, Grant and Sherman dominate the southern generals. And so really and truly, while the two best generals are in the South, Jackson and Lee, the next two best are in the North. And while Lee and Jackson dominate the East, Grant and Sherman dominate the West. And ultimately, it is Sherman who's going to cut across the entire South and just lay siege and light a fire from, well, Alabama all the way to Atlanta, all the way to the sea, and just destroy the communication lines, the travel lines, and just destroy morale in the South. And it's worth noting that pretty much all the generals were all trained at the best schools, most of them at West Point, and all the commanding officers all had the same field experience. They all cut their teeth in the Mexican-American War under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. And thus, while, yes, there's some advantages here and there, they all have similar background experience. And so in practical terms, they often even scripted their battle plans along similar lines. And so the reality is, it's kind of a myth that the South had the major advantage. The North was quite well stocked when it came to generals. But in the end, the North will prevail, spoiler alert. And of course, on April 8th, 1865, the South will surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And with that, the war has come to a close, but the question now is, how do you rebuild the South? How do you restore our Union? And what does a new, greater United States look like? We'll talk about that in our next lecture, but until then, take care and bye-bye.